Close your eyes. Let the weight of the day slowly lift from your shoulders. The flicker of ancient torches, the distant clang of rusted swords, the slow toll of a bell echoing through stone corridors. Now imagine this. You're a peasant. Dirt under your nails. Bread is rare. The winter's cruel. But it's not nature that threatens you most. It's your king. Not a noble ruler, not a wise old sage, but a tyrant, a fool, or worse, someone too lost in madness to know the difference. History tends to honor the mighty, the victorious, the revered. But tonight, we turn the pages of a darker chapter, one filled with incompetence, cruelty, and rulers whose reigns were marred by blood, chaos, or absurdity. These are the kings who failed their people and themselves. This is the worst kings of history. Chapter 1. The king who lost everything. The year is 1215. The winds over England carry the chill of discontent. In the great halls of Windsor sits a man in heavy robes. A crown rests awkwardly upon his head, as if it doesn't quite belong there. His name is John, but history knows him better as John Lackland, the king who lost more land, loyalty, and legacy than perhaps any monarch before or after him. John was the youngest son of Henry II and brother to the legendary Richard the Lionheart. But where Richard was bold and charismatic, John was suspicious, petty, and vindictive. While Richard went on crusades and earned songs in his name, John stayed behind and schemed. He raised taxes to unbearable levels, seized property at will, and quarreled constantly with the church. He imprisoned opponents, excommunicated clergy, and even starved the family of a nobleman to death in a dungeon. And still, he found a way to make things worse. In 1215, after years of civil strife, a group of barons forced John to sign a document that would change the course of English governance forever. It was called the Magna Carta, but John never meant to honor it. No, he signed it under pressure, and then tore it apart, both literally and politically. War broke out. His allies abandoned him, and his enemies closed in. He died a year later, possibly of dysentery, unloved and alone. Even his own court chroniclers described him as cruel, untrustworthy, and utterly unfit to rule. One monk wrote simply, "Hell itself is too good for a man like John. Sleep now and drift through time as we leave the damp forests of England and ride east to a desert empire ruled by one of history's most disastrous kings." Chapter 2. The Boy Who Played at Empire. Now, picture the great Roman Empire. Marble palaces gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. Columns rising high above crowded forums. Senators debating, soldiers marching, citizens bustling in the markets. All beneath the rule of an emperor. But in the early 3rd century, Rome's power trembled under the sandals of a teenage boy who worshipped the sun and little else. His name was Elagabalus. He became emperor at just 14 years old. Placed on the throne by his ambitious grandmother, Elagabalus was no ordinary boy. He wasn't raised to lead legions or manage the empire's vast provinces. No, his passion lay in the rituals of a Syrian sun god, a deity called Elagabal, after whom he took his name. When he arrived in Rome, he brought more than a new religion. He brought chaos. Dressed in lavish robes and adorned with jewels, Elagabalus turned the imperial palace into a theater of extravagance. He appointed his lovers to high political positions. He hosted banquets where guests were buried in rose petals, so many that some reportedly suffocated. He replaced Jupiter, the chief Roman god, with his own Eastern deity, forcing Rome to bow before a black meteorite he called divine. The Senate, the army, and the people watched in disbelief. Some laughed, some whispered, others began to plot. He married not once, not twice, but up to 5 times, including, allegedly, to a Vestal Virgin, a sacred priestess forbidden from marriage under Roman law. And still, it wasn't enough. Elagabalus would roam the streets at night in disguise, visiting taverns and brothels. He installed golden toilets, released snakes into dinner parties, and once reportedly invited guests to a feast, only to serve them wax and stones instead of food. It might sound absurd, but to the Roman elite, it was terrifying. The empire felt leaderless, vulnerable, unstable. At just 18 years old, Elagabalus was murdered by his own guards in a latrine. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. Rome tried to forget him, but history remembers. The emperor who danced in silks, worshipped a stone, and nearly unstitched the greatest empire the world had known, all before he was old enough to grow a beard. Now, as the moon glides across the sky, we leave the Roman marble behind and drift further east to a king whose cruelty was so legendary, his very name became a warning whispered for centuries. Chapter 3: The Butcher of the Congo. The fire has grown low now. Its embers flicker quietly, casting long shadows across the wooden floor of history. Outside, the rain falls in steady rhythm, soft, almost musical, but far away from the peace of night. There once echoed the screams of a forgotten land. Tonight, we enter the Age of Empires, a time when Europe carved up the map of the world, and kings claimed lands they would never see, lives they would never know, all in the name of progress and profit. One such king, perhaps the worst of them all, was Leopold II of Belgium. To the public, he appeared every bit the modern monarch, refined, well-dressed, intelligent. He spoke of civilization, of philanthropy, of bringing light to the so-called Dark Continent. But behind this polished mask was a private empire drenched in blood. In 1885, Leopold laid personal claim to a vast region of Central Africa, what would come to be known as the Congo Free State. But it wasn't free, not for the people who lived there, and it had nothing to do with Belgium. It was his, not the country's, his private colony. Under the guise of humanitarian work, Leopold unleashed one of the most brutal forced labor systems the world has ever known. Villages were raided. Men were taken to harvest rubber deep in the jungle. Women were held hostage. Children mutilated. Failure to meet rubber quotas meant punishment, often by bullet. But bullets were expensive, so soldiers were ordered to cut off the hands of those they killed to prove they hadn't wasted ammunition. Sometimes they brought hands instead of corpses. Sometimes the hands belonged to the living. It is estimated that between 8 to 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's reign. That's nearly half the population. Gone. And yet, in Belgium, he built grand monuments. He was praised. He commissioned palaces, galleries, and gardens, with money stolen from a land he had never loved. Even when the truth emerged, Leopold escaped justice. International pressure eventually forced him to hand over the Congo to the Belgian government in 1908. But not before he destroyed documents, burned records, and filled his private accounts. When he died the following year, crowds jeered as his funeral procession passed. A contemporary British diplomat would later say he was a man of greed, cloaked in the robes of civilization, and every stone in his monuments is cemented with blood. Sleep comes slowly now, as we drift down the wide, silent river that coils through the heart of the Congo. Its waters dark, its history darker still, and from there we return again to the east, to a kingdom of gold and glory, and a ruler whose thirst for conquest left his people starved, broken, and betrayed. Chapter 4: The King Who Lost His Mind. The fire crackles softly once more. Outside, the wind whispers through the ancient trees of a forgotten forest, and in the flicker of shadows, we find ourselves in medieval France, a land torn by war, famine, and unrest, a kingdom desperate for guidance, for strength, and yet, on the throne sits a man who drifts between two worlds, one of royal power and one of madness. This is the story of Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad. At first, he was young, handsome, and full of promise. The people called him Charles the Beloved. He was crowned in glittering ceremonies, his kingdom full of hope. But behind the golden crowns and velvet robes, something dark stirred within him. It began quietly. Strange outbursts, sudden, unexplained anger, moments when the young king seemed lost, his eyes distant, his words confused. Then, one hot summer day in 1392, it all unraveled. Riding with his knights through the forest, Charles suddenly stopped. His gaze turned wild, and without warning, he drew his sword and attacked his own men, striking them down in a blind fury. When the madness passed, he remembered nothing, but something had shattered inside him, and it would never heal. For the next 30 years, France was ruled by a ghost. Charles believed he was made of glass, terrified that he might shatter if touched. He forgot the faces of his children. At times, he could not recall he was king at all. He howled in the night. He wandered the halls of his palace, lost in a fog of confusion and terror. And while he drifted deeper into madness, France crumbled. The 100 Years' War raged on. England's armies invaded. The kingdom fractured between rival factions, each seeking to control the throne left vacant by a king who no longer recognized himself. In the end, Charles's reign was marked not by conquest, but by collapse, not by glory, but by despair. He died in 1422, a broken shadow of the man he had once been. France lay in ruins, and his name would forever be tied to madness. Now, let your mind drift quietly as we leave the haunted halls of medieval France and journey onward to another throne where ambition, greed, and cruelty would once again bring ruin. Chapter 5: The Tsar of Terror. The night deepens. The wind has grown still. All that remains is the soft crackle of unseen embers and the slow, steady breath of time itself. Now, we journey far to the east, across frozen rivers, endless forests, and snow-covered plains, to the vast, cold heart of Russia. And there, on a gilded throne beneath the domes of Moscow, sits a ruler whose very name became a legend of fear, Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. But he wasn't always terrible, at least, not at the beginning. Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at just 3 years old, an orphaned child raised in the shadows of cold palace walls, surrounded by cruelty, betrayal, and endless whispers. By the time he was crowned the first Tsar of all the Russias, the seeds of darkness had already taken root. At first, his reign brought promise. He reformed laws, strengthened the military, and expanded his realm. But soon, the paranoia began to grow. He trusted no one. He saw enemies in every corner, traitors in every face, and so he unleashed terror. He created a private army, the oprichniki, dressed in black robes, their saddles decorated with severed dogs' heads and broomsticks, symbols of their mission to sniff out and sweep away treachery. They rode through villages, leaving only ash, blood, and fear. Tens of thousands died. Entire cities were destroyed. Even the nobility, the boyars, cowered in silence. But the darkest moment came not in the fields of war, but within Ivan's own family. In a fit of rage, the Tsar struck his eldest son, his heir, with an iron staff. The young prince collapsed and never rose again. When Ivan realized what he had done, he cradled his son's broken body, weeping in despair. The man who ruled a vast empire had lost the one thing no crown could ever replace. Ivan died in 1584, seated on his throne, playing a quiet game of chess. His heart simply stopped. His reign, a legacy of terror, sorrow, and unending fear. Now, as the cold winds of the Russian steppes fade into silence, let your breath soften, your thoughts drift, as we leave the Tsar behind. And soon, we will journey again to another distant land and to another ruler whose failures shaped the fate of nations. Chapter 6, The Last Catholic King and the Fall of the Stuarts. The night is deep and quiet now. Outside, the world holds its breath beneath a velvet sky, scattered with distant stars. Inside the chambers of history, a tale unfolds, soft, slow, and measured, of a king who stood at the crossroads of faith and power, whose reign would forever alter the destiny of England. This is the story of James II, the last Catholic monarch to wear the English crown. Born in 1633 into the turbulent Stuart dynasty, James grew up amidst shadowed corridors and glittering courts. His youth was marked by the echoes of civil war, brothers, fathers, and kings locked in fierce conflict that tore the kingdom apart. Raised by his mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, a devout Catholic, James inherited a faith that would set him apart in a land scarred by Protestant triumph and religious suspicion. His older brother, Charles II, ascended the throne after years of exile and turmoil, bringing a fragile peace. But James, steady, serious, and deeply faithful, waited in the wings, his heart burdened by the growing tension between crown and parliament, between Catholic and Protestant. When Charles II died in 1685, James took the throne at a time when England was a land teetering on the edge. His accession was met with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope from those who believed a strong king could restore order. Fear from those who saw in his Catholicism a looming threat to the Protestant nation. James was a man of conviction. He believed deeply in the divine right of kings, that monarchs ruled by God's will alone. He sought to promote religious tolerance, particularly for Catholics and Protestant dissenters. But his methods were rigid, unyielding. He filled government and military positions with Catholics, upsetting a parliament that jealously guarded its Protestant heritage. Despite his intentions, distrust festered. Whispers turned to accusations. Some feared he aimed to restore Catholicism as the state religion. Others worried he would use his royal power to impose his will without Parliament's consent. The tension grew thick, like fog over the Thames on a cold morning. The country was divided. Loyalists stood firm in their support. Opponents gathered in shadow, plotting what would come to be called the Glorious Revolution. In 1688, a group of English nobles, calling themselves the Immortal Seven, invited William of Orange, husband to James's Protestant daughter Mary, to cross the sea and take the throne. William arrived with an army, but the country did not rise to defend James. His own generals and advisors abandoned him. His support melted away like ice in spring. Faced with betrayal and defeat, James fled England, crossing the Channel under the cover of night, retreating to the court of Louis XIV in France. His flight marked the end of Stuart absolutism and the beginning of constitutional monarchy in England. Parliament's power was secured, and the Protestant succession guaranteed. But James's life in exile was not one of ease. He lived quietly at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, his once mighty crown reduced to memories and whispered prayers. Though stripped of his throne, his faith remained unbroken. He clung to his hope of restoration, but the tides of history had turned. His legacy is one of contrasts, a king who wished to rule by divine right, yet was undone by the very people he sought to govern, a man of faith and conviction who found himself rejected in a kingdom that feared his beliefs, a monarch whose fall reshaped the future of England, laying the groundwork for a constitutional system that would endure. As you rest now, imagine the quiet halls of an ancient palace, lit only by flickering candlelight. Hear the distant echo of footsteps fading down empty corridors. Feel the cool touch of evening air through open windows, and let the story of James II, the last Catholic king, gently ease your thoughts into calm and quiet dreams, where the past drifts softly into sleep. Chapter 7. The Mad Emperor of Rome. The night stretches on, soft and still. The world outside drifts into quiet slumber, and here, in the shadows of the ancient past, we find ourselves walking once more through the marble streets of Rome, an empire vast and powerful, yet shaken by the rule of one man whose name would echo through time as a symbol of madness and destruction. This is the story of Nero, the emperor who wore the purple robes of Rome, but who let ambition and paranoia burn away reason and mercy. Born in 37 AD into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero was a boy of privilege and promise. Raised under the careful guidance of his mother, Agrippina the Younger, he ascended to the throne at the tender age of 16, becoming one of Rome's youngest emperors. At first, his reign showed signs of hope. He was generous to the people, promoting arts and games and easing taxes. But beneath the glittering surface, darkness was gathering. Nero's rule soon became marked by cruelty and excess. He was known for his extravagant banquets, where guests were overwhelmed with lavish food and wine. He fancied himself a great artist and performer, forcing senators and nobles to watch his theatrical shows. Many endured them in silence, fearful of his wrath. His paranoia grew like a shadow creeping over Rome. He suspected everyone of plotting against him, even his own family. He ordered the murder of his mother, his wife, and countless perceived enemies. No one was safe from his suspicion. Then came the great disaster, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. For 6 days and nights, the city burned. Temples, homes, and markets turned to ash. Thousands were left homeless. Rumors swirled that Nero himself had started the fire, that he played music and sang while watching his city burn. A chilling image, though likely a myth. What is certain is that Nero seized the tragedy to rebuild Rome according to his own vision, erecting a massive palace, the Domus Aurea, filled with gold and extravagance. His rule grew increasingly tyrannical. Opposition was crushed. Citizens lived in fear. The Senate grew silent, and rebellion whispered in the streets. In 68 AD, Nero faced a revolt. Abandoned by the army and the people, he fled Rome. Alone, he took his own life, his death marking the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's legacy is one of infamy, a ruler whose reign was a tempest of madness, cruelty, and self-indulgence, whose name remains a warning of unchecked power and pride. Now, as the night deepens and your eyes grow heavy, let the echoes of ancient Rome fade softly into your dreams. Let the story of Nero, the mad emperor who lost himself to the fire, carry you gently into restful sleep. Chapter 8. The Last King of Ancien Regime. As the night deepens and the world outside quiets into stillness, we travel back through the centuries to the heart of France in the late 18th century, a time of great change, great unrest, and an ending that would reshape the course of history forever. This is the story of Louis XVI, the last king to rule France before the storm of revolution swept away the old world. Born in 1754, Louis grew up in the grandeur of the Palace of Versailles, surrounded by opulence, courtly rituals, and the expectations of royalty. He was groomed from childhood for the throne. He was a man of quiet demeanor, thoughtful and gentle, yet weighed down by the burdens of his position. When he became king in 1774, France was a kingdom on the brink. Its people faced hardship, heavy taxes, and hunger. The country's finances were strained from years of war and extravagant spending. Yet Louis struggled to find his place, a ruler who wanted peace and reform, but was trapped by tradition and circumstance. He called the Estates General in 1789, hoping to solve the kingdom's financial crisis. But what began as a meeting of representatives from the clergy, nobility, and commoners soon spiraled into a revolution. The Third Estate, representing the common people, declared themselves the National Assembly, demanding a new constitution. The old order trembled. Palaces were stormed. Voices rose in the streets. And Louis, caught between his duty as king and the tide of change, found himself powerless. He attempted to flee in 1791, a failed escape that shattered the remaining trust. His image as a ruler waned, replaced by suspicion and anger. The revolution grew more radical, and the monarchy's grip slipped away. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished. Louis was arrested, tried for treason, and condemned. In 1793, he met his fate at the guillotine, his life ending under the shadow of the very symbol of the revolution. Yet Louis was not a tyrant. He was a man overwhelmed by forces beyond his control, a king outpaced by the currents of history. His reign marked the twilight of an era, the end of the Ancien Regime, and the beginning of a new world. As you rest tonight, imagine the quiet halls of Versailles, the gilded mirrors, the flickering chandeliers, the slow footsteps fading into silence. Hear the soft murmur of distant voices, whispers of a world slipping away. Let the story of Louis XVI, the last king of old France, gently carry you into peaceful dreams, where history's final breaths unfold softly under the watchful stars. Chapter 9. The Mad Sultan of Istanbul. The night stretches onward, calm, still, and hushed. Soft shadows gather beneath ancient arches, and in the gentle rhythm of breath and silence, we travel eastward now, to the golden domes and marble courtyards of the great Ottoman Empire. There, on the shimmering waters of the Bosphorus, stands the city of Istanbul, once Constantinople, its skyline crowned with minarets. its palaces gleaming beneath the moon. And within those palace walls, centuries ago, sat a ruler whose story has been whispered down the ages as one of tragedy, instability, and sorrow. This is the story of Sultan Ibrahim I, remembered by history as Ibrahim the Mad. He was born in 1615, the youngest son of Sultan Ahmed I. The palace into which he was born, the Grand Topkapi Palace, was a place of splendor, but also of shadows. In this world, brothers could be rivals, and survival was never guaranteed. Ibrahim's early life was shaped by fear. His brothers were executed one by one, victims of the Ottoman practice of fratricide, a brutal tradition meant to prevent civil war by eliminating competing heirs. By the time his elder brother Murad IV died, Ibrahim was the last surviving male of the dynasty, and so, in 1640, at the age of 25, he became Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, ruler of one of the most powerful realms on earth. But his years locked away in the palace's dark, silent chambers, confined for his own safety, had taken their toll. Ibrahim emerged not as a confident leader, but as a fragile, broken man. He was deeply anxious, prone to wild mood swings, and haunted by paranoia. The empire he inherited stretched across 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its armies feared, its wealth vast. But Ibrahim himself seemed ill-equipped for the weight of the crown. At first, he placed his trust in his mother, Qasem Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Under her careful guidance, the affairs of state were managed, and the empire remained steady. But soon, Ibrahim's erratic behavior began to show. He became obsessed with the luxury of the palace, lavish feasts, fine silks, rare jewels. He surrounded himself with courtiers who flattered his every whim. He ordered extravagant gifts for his harem, commissioning clothing embroidered with gold and diamonds. But the most peculiar of his fixations was his obsession with women. Historical accounts, some true, some perhaps exaggerated, tell of his demand for an enormous harem of concubines. One story, often repeated though impossible to fully verify, speaks of his infatuation with a particularly large woman whom he allegedly called the Sable One, whom he showered with riches and affection. While the court descended into decadence, the empire outside faced real troubles: wars with Venice, uprisings in the provinces, and growing unrest among the Janissaries, the empire's elite military corps. Ibrahim, however, withdrew further into his private world of excess. He issued bizarre decrees, ordering the drowning of hundreds of palace concubines on mere suspicion of disloyalty, demanding absurd expenses that emptied the treasury. His paranoia worsened. He feared assassination at every turn, sometimes wearing armor beneath his robes, even within the palace walls. Eventually, his erratic rule became too dangerous to ignore. In 1648, after 8 turbulent years on the throne, the patience of the empire's elite, viziers, religious leaders, and soldiers, reached its end. Ibrahim was deposed in a palace coup. He was confined once more to the palace, this time not as a prince, but as a fallen sultan. A few days later, by the order of the court, he was quietly executed, strangled in the traditional Ottoman manner. He was just 32 years old. Ibrahim's reign is remembered as one of the most chaotic and tragic in Ottoman history. Yet behind the stories of madness lies a deeper sadness. A man raised in fear, imprisoned by tradition, crushed by the impossible expectations of empire. As the night grows quieter still, let your mind drift to the soft lapping of the Bosphorus waves beneath silver moonlight, the distant call to prayer echoing gently across old Istanbul, and the faded footsteps of a troubled sultan who once walked the marble halls of Topkapi. His story, now part of the endless tapestry of time. Rest now. Let the past settle softly as you sink deeper into peaceful sleep. For the city, the palace, and the empire sleep too, and all is calm once more. Chapter 10. The Emperor Who Lost Himself. The night is still. The quiet breath of ancient time drifts softly through the dark. And as you sink deeper into calm, we return once more to the marble streets of Rome, to the story of a ruler whose name would echo through history as a symbol of cruelty, chaos, and madness. This is the story of Caligula. He was born in 12 AD, a child of the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty. Raised among military camps, he earned the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, from the tiny soldier's sandals he wore as a boy. The empire adored him, and when Emperor Tiberius died, young Gaius Caligula took the throne in 37 AD. The people rejoiced. The new emperor was seen as a fresh beginning, generous, handsome, beloved. At first, he fulfilled those hopes. He freed prisoners, rewarded the army, and hosted lavish games. But something shifted. After a sudden, serious illness, Caligula's behavior darkened. His kindness gave way to paranoia, violence, and grand delusions. He began to see himself not merely as emperor, but as a living god. He ordered statues of himself as Jupiter. He demanded worship, divine honors, and bowed heads. His cruelty deepened. Historical accounts tell of executions on a whim, humiliations of senators, and reckless spending. One famous tale, half legend, half truth, tells of his favorite horse, Incitatus. The emperor adored the animal so much that he gave it a marble stable, golden feed, and, so it said, planned to make it a consul of Rome. The people watched in fear. The Senate seethed in silence. The empire trembled under the weight of one man's madness. After just 4 years on the throne, in the year 41 AD, the end came. A group of conspirators, his own Praetorian guards, struck within the palace. Caligula was assassinated, his life cut short at just 28 years old. The streets of Rome grew quiet. The golden halls dimmed. The echoes of his laughter faded into the stone. Caligula's reign, though brief, remains one of history's most infamous. A young emperor consumed by delusions, whose downfall left behind a legend of terror and sorrow. And now, as you rest, let the marble arches of ancient Rome dissolve softly into the night. Let the story of Caligula drift away and sink deeper into peaceful sleep, where the distant past fades gently into dreams. Chapter 11. A Crown in a Foreign Land. The night stretches long and quiet now. The soft breath of wind moves gently across distant oceans, carrying us to the warm lands of the Americas, to a story less known, but deeply woven with ambition, tragedy, and quiet sorrow. This is the story of Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico, a man who crossed seas, wore a crown not truly his own, and whose life would end beneath the silent sky of a distant land. Our story begins far from Mexico, in the royal courts of Vienna, where Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph was born in 1832 into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, one of the oldest and most influential royal families of Europe. Maximilian was a thoughtful child, curious and cultured. He loved the arts, the sciences, and the beauty of the natural world. Unlike many princes of his time, he was gentle, reflective, more drawn to books and gardens than to politics or war. For much of his early life, Maximilian lived in the grand palaces of Austria, never imagining that one day he would wear a crown in a land he had never seen. The winds of fate shifted in the 1860s as Mexico, across the Atlantic, found itself torn by political unrest, its young republic weakened by internal conflict and foreign debts. French Emperor Napoleon III, seeking to expand his influence in the Americas, saw an opportunity. With the support of Mexican conservatives who longed for monarchy, Napoleon offered Maximilian the chance to become Emperor of Mexico. At first, Maximilian hesitated. He was no conqueror, but he was idealistic. He dreamed of bringing peace, justice, and European refinement to Mexico. And so, in 1864, he and his wife, Carlota, of Belgium, set sail for the New World. They arrived to grand ceremony, but beneath the surface, the empire they were to rule was fragile, divided, and deeply unstable. The vast majority of Mexicans did not want monarchy. The republic, led by President Benito Juarez, resisted fiercely. Maximilian, in his heart, wanted to be a benevolent ruler. He introduced progressive reforms, protected indigenous rights, and sought to bridge the gap between the wealthy elite and the poor. But he was a stranger in a land that did not trust him, a foreign king with no firm ground beneath his feet. The conflict between monarchy and republic deepened into war. France, facing pressure in Europe, withdrew its military support. Maximilian, offered the chance to flee, chose to remain, out of honor, duty, or perhaps quiet despair. He believed that abandoning his throne would be a betrayal of the people he was meant to serve. In 1867, Republican forces captured Maximilian. He was tried, sentenced to death, and on a quiet morning in Querétaro, he faced the firing squad with calm dignity. He was just 34 years old. His final words, according to some accounts, were gentle. "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood be the last to be shed." His young wife, Carlota, driven mad by grief, would live out the rest of her life in lonely exile, her mind forever trapped in the palace halls of memory. Maximilian's short reign remains one of history's most tragic tales. A well-meaning man, an emperor who never sought to conquer, but who became the fragile center of a dream that could never truly belong to him. As you rest now, let the quiet winds of the Mexican hills drift softly through your thoughts. Imagine the warm glow of lanterns over cobbled streets, the stillness of distant mountains beneath a violet sky, and let the story of Emperor Maximilian, his hopes, his sorrows, and his quiet dignity fade gently into the peaceful silence of the night. Chapter 12. The Young King and the Fall of the Plantagenets. The night deepens gently, and the quiet whispers of history call us back to the rolling hills and ancient stone castles of medieval England. Among the stories wrapped in fog and shadow is one of a young king whose reign was marked by struggle, pride, and tragedy. This is the tale of Richard II, a monarch whose crown would slip from his brow as the tides of power shifted beneath him. Born in 1367, Richard ascended the throne as a mere child of just 10 years old, after the death of his grandfather, Edward III. The kingdom was weary from years of war and political strife, and the weight of rule pressed heavily on his young shoulders. Guided by regents and nobles, Richard's early years were filled with ceremonies and careful lessons in kingship. Yet the challenges he faced were immense. As he grew, so too did his desire to assert his authority. Richard was a king who believed deeply in the divine right of monarchs, the idea that a king's power was granted by God, and above all earthly challenge. His reign saw moments of brilliance, patronage of the arts, and a vision of royal grandeur, but also shadows of unrest and rebellion. The late 14th century was a turbulent time in England. The Black Death had left scars on the land, and people, the 100 Years' War against France, continued to drain the treasury, and noble factions vied for influence at court. Richard's efforts to strengthen royal power brought him into conflict with powerful barons who resented his attempts to rule without their consent. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt erupted, fueled by economic hardship and anger at taxation. Though Richard was young, he personally met with the rebels, displaying a mix of mercy and firmness that quelled the uprising, at least for a time. But as years passed, Richard's rule became increasingly autocratic. He relied on a small group of favorites, alienating much of the nobility. His lavish spending and harsh punishments sowed seeds of discontent. The tension culminated in 1399, when his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, returned from exile with an army. Richard was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The throne was claimed by Henry, who became Henry IV, marking the end of Richard's reign and the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty. Richard's final days were lonely and bleak. He was held prisoner, his fate sealed in shadow. In 1400, at just 33 years old, he died, some say of starvation, others whisper of assassination. His life and reign remain a poignant story of youthful idealism, royal pride, and the fragile nature of power. A king who dreamed of absolute rule, but was undone by the very forces he sought to command. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine the soft candlelight flickering in a medieval chamber, the distant howl of wind over stone battlements, and the gentle weight of history folding slowly into night. Let the story of Richard II carry you gently into dreams, where crowns are heavy and even kings must yield to time's quiet hand. Chapter 13. The Mad King and the Fragmented Kingdom. The night falls gently over the ancient lands of medieval France. The moon's pale light washes softly over the quiet villages, rolling hills, and stone castles that stretch across the countryside. And in the quiet of the evening, we turn our thoughts to a king whose reign was marked not by triumph or glory, but by tragedy, darkness, and the slow fracturing of a kingdom once mighty and proud. This is the story of Charles VI, known to history as Charles the Mad. Born in 1368 to King Charles V and Queen Joanna of Bourbon, Charles was heir to the throne of France at a time when the country faced great challenges. The 100 Years' War with England was ongoing, a brutal conflict that had stretched on for decades, draining resources and sowing unrest. Yet, in his early years, Charles was a promising young prince, well-educated, pious, and trained in the ways of kingship under the watchful eyes of his father and advisors. When Charles V died in 1380, the crown passed to his 12-year-old son, Charles VI. A boy king in a turbulent era, his early reign was guided by regents and a council of powerful nobles. The kingdom hoped for stability, yet the challenges ahead would prove overwhelming. As Charles grew into adulthood, the shadow of his mental illness began to darken his life and the fate of France. In 1392, during a military campaign near the Loire River, Charles suffered his first severe episode of madness. Accounts tell of a terrifying attack during which the king, gripped by delusion and paranoia, turned violently against his own men, killing some before collapsing into unconsciousness. This was only the beginning. Over the years, Charles's mental health deteriorated. He suffered repeated episodes of psychosis, hallucinations, and violent outbursts. At times, he was unaware of his own identity, wandering the palace halls in confusion. The king, who should have been the embodiment of strength and unity, became a figure of fear and instability. His illness shattered the French court. Factions formed around his advisors, each vying for power and control. The king's wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, struggled to manage the kingdom and her husband's care amidst growing political chaos. Meanwhile, the enemies of France watched closely. The English crown, led by King Henry V, saw opportunity in the turmoil. Battles like the devastating defeat of the French at Agincourt in 1415 deepened the crisis. The kingdom fractured, nobles fought amongst themselves, and loyalty to the crown weakened. Charles VI's reign spanned 4 decades, yet his ability to govern was limited by his illness. His body ruled, but his mind often wandered far from the throne. And with his weakening grip on power, the seeds of civil war were sown. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, a bitter conflict between noble factions, erupted within France itself. It tore the country apart from within, further weakening resistance to the English. Charles died in 1422, worn by illness and years of strife. His death marked the end of an era, but the troubles he left behind would shape the destiny of France for generations. As you rest tonight, let your thoughts drift gently through the ancient castles and misty forests of medieval France. Let the story of Charles VI, the mad king and fractured realm, carry you softly into peaceful dreams, where even the heaviest crowns eventually rest. The early years of Charles VI's reign, though under regency, offered a fragile hope for France's future. His father, Charles V, had been a strong and capable ruler, earning the nickname the Wise for his intelligence and reforms. Under Charles V's guidance, the French crown had managed to reclaim much territory lost to the English in previous years of the 100 Years' War. The kingdom's finances improved, law and order were restored, and a sense of cautious optimism blossomed among the people. But the young Charles VI inherited a kingdom still scarred by decades of warfare and political unrest. At just 12 years old, the boy king was thrust into a world filled with expectations, rivalries, and dangers that no child should face. During his early reign, a council of nobles and advisors, including his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou, acted as regents, effectively managing the kingdom's affairs. However, the seeds of division were already present. The powerful nobles jostled for influence, eager to shape the young king and the future of France according to their own ambitions. As Charles matured, he began to take more control, eager to prove his capability as a monarch. Early on, he showed promise. He was known for his piety, charm, and keen mind. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Then, in August 1392, the fragile peace shattered. During a military expedition near Le Mans, Charles suddenly became violently ill. Historical accounts vary in detail, but they tell of a terrifying episode during which the king, seized by a fit of madness, attacked his own men, believing them to be enemies. His own bodyguard barely escaped with his life. This first episode was a harbinger of the long tragic battle Charles would wage against his own mind. Following this initial crisis, Charles experienced recurring bouts of mental illness throughout his reign. These episodes ranged from periods of deep confusion and incoherence to violent rages and delusions. Sometimes he would refuse to speak for days, lost in his own mind. Other times, he believed himself to be made of glass, so fragile that he feared to be touched, lest he shatter. The court grew divided as factions rallied around competing advisors, each trying to assert control during the king's incapacitations. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, Charles's wife, found herself in an impossible position, caring for a husband who was often a stranger and trying to maintain order in a kingdom slipping toward chaos. In this climate of instability, the noble families of France began to fracture into two major factions: the Armagnacs, loyal to the Duke of Orléans and supportive of the royal line, and the Burgundians, led by the Duke of Burgundy, who sought greater autonomy and power. Their rivalry exploded into open civil war, further weakening the kingdom's ability to resist its enemies abroad. Across the English Channel, King Henry V watched with growing interest. A brilliant and ruthless leader, Henry understood that a divided France was vulnerable. He renewed English claims on French lands and invaded with a well-prepared army. The infamous Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was a devastating blow to France. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the English forces, aided by longbowmen and favorable terrain, routed the French nobility. Thousands of French knights and soldiers fell that day, including many from the factions fighting over power at court. This defeat deepened the sense of despair within France. The crown's authority was weakened, and the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians intensified. Throughout all this, Charles VI remained a tragic figure, often isolated, sometimes unaware of the turmoil around him. His illness left him unable to govern, while those around him fought to claim power in his name. In 1419, a shocking event further altered the course of French history. The Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, was assassinated during a meeting on a bridge in Montereau, deepening the hatred between the Burgundian and Armagnac factions. The ensuing violence escalated into years of bitter conflict. Meanwhile, the English renewed their campaigns, and in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. This treaty disinherited Charles's son, the future Charles VII, and recognized Henry V of England as heir to the French throne, effectively dividing the kingdom. Charles VI, now an old man suffering from years of mental and physical decline, saw his kingdom torn apart by factionalism and foreign invasion. He died in 1422, his passing marking the end of an era, but also leaving France plunged into further chaos. His reign, marked by his struggle with mental illness and the fracturing of royal authority, remains one of the most tragic in medieval European history. As the night deepens and the world grows quiet, we come to the close of our journey through history's shadows, the tales of kings who bore heavy crowns, whose reigns were marked by tragedy, turmoil, and the frailty of human nature. From distant palaces bathed in moonlight to battlefields silent beneath stars, we've wandered through the lives of rulers who, despite their power, were bound by fears, flaws, and the weight of their own decisions. We have seen the fragility beneath the gold and silk, the kings who lost themselves in madness and despair, who ruled with cruelty or confusion, and whose legacies remind us that power is never without its burden. Yet, beyond their faults and failures, these stories hold a quiet truth that behind every crown lies a human heart, beating with hopes, fears, and dreams much like our own. As you rest now, let these tales fade gently into the night's embrace. Let the distant echoes of history become a lullaby, carrying you softly into dreams where time slows and the burdens of the day fall away. May the silence of the past bring peace to your present, and may you awaken refreshed, ready to write your own story beneath the endless sky. Good night. Sleep well.